The prophetic words of Marvin Gaye. Good evening, everyone. I'm Kimberle Crenshaw, Executive Director of the African American Policy Forum. Together with the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, we welcome you to a special social justice SOS edition of our series, Under the Blacklight, the intersectional failures that COVID lays bare. Tonight, we're diving deep into these traumatic and cataclysmic times. We're calling this episode, Under the Blacklight, the fire this time. Engulfed by a dark shadow of despair and distress, after bearing witness to the calculated cruelty of Derek Chauvin casually pressing the life out of George Floyd, we found ourselves in a solar ecliptic moment. Our hearts will never be the same after hearing a man beg for his life beneath Derek's knee, calling out in desperation for his dead mother, and finally succumbing to the weight of American law enforcement. This utter expendability of Black life is amplified by the bloodletting that preceded it. The police killing of EMT Breonna Taylor, shot 8 times in the dead of night by home invaders adorned with the badge of impunity. Taylor's death was not captured for the world to see, and her murder falls far from the available frames we have used to imagine what anti-Black police violence looks like. She was a woman. She was killed inside her own home, like all too many other Black women killed by police are. And the killing of Breonna Taylor was echoed a month later when Ahmaud Arbery was hunted and killed by a vigilante father-son duo, a killing that only sparked outrage when the tape of it was put in the possession of the media after the law enforcement had it for over a month. All of this, the targeted lethality of white supremacy, coupled and manifested with the disproportionate effects of a virus that's already claimed over 100,000 lives, marks this moment of eclipsing of the peril and the possibility as being the red summer of 2020. We are in this country in a state of disorder, revealing that the quietude that preceded this moment was not a peace built on justice, but a silence predicated on a casually inflicted suffering, perpetrated in tandem with a media and a justice system that at best ignored the systemic and everyday nature of police violence, and at worst, facilitated and abetted it. Social movement historians really can never tell us in advance what the watershed moments are that galvanizes movements from below. The movement when masses of people denounce the status quo with an intention never to go back to normal. Now, time will tell whether this is such a moment. And if it is, history may one day tell the story about how this too is a moment that COVID laid bare the foundational logic of Black bodies' essential yet expendable role in American society. 100,000 people have perished from this disease, a disproportionate number of them Black people, yet society seems prepared to accept these costs just as casually as Derek Chauvin took George Floyd's life. For those of us at risk, just as there is a thin line separating the killer from those who allow the killer to kill, there is a thin line between COVID's ravages and a society that is ready to move on. Floyd's death might be that singular event that brings the thousands of expendable lives more fully into view. So throughout this social justice Zoom SOS, we want to hear from you. We will be sharing comments and questions with our panelists throughout the event and inviting a few select participants to our post-show talkback to talk about what we need to know to move this moment forward. So let's get right to it. What do we make of this moment and what is to be done? Well, first, there is the matter of justice. And so to begin today's discussion, I'm honored to speak with Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. I'm especially grateful to General Ellison for coming on the Blacklight in light of developments that have taken place since he agreed to join us for this episode. The oversight of the case against the officers involved in George Floyd's death has now been placed under his office. And just today, Charges have been amended against Derek Chauvin to second-degree murder, and new charges have been brought against the 3 other officers involved in George Floyd's death. It's safe to say that General Ellison is very much in demand right now. So his willingness to sit down with us speaks volumes about his commitment to justice in the face of an unjust world. So in light of the changing context, we've asked General Ellison to speak with us for a few minutes before going to the rest of the panel. So General Ellison, welcome to Under the Blacklight. As I've already noted,
Thank you.
Context. So thank you. So the context of your appearance has changed since we both talked about you coming on Saturday. And I want to be mindful of the fact that you are a direct actor in the unfolding prosecution. So we understand that there are some constraints about what we can explore. So we'll talk more broadly about the contours of the moment. And those contours include the fact that Minnesota is now the epicenter of a global movement sparked by the killing of George Floyd. And now you've taken on the role of lead in the prosecution of these officers. So in a sense, now you are under the black light. This case, I think, is going to be known as the case of the century. And at the same time, we know it's almost impossible to convict people who kill while wearing an officer's uniform, almost impossible. So as you step into this role, what is front and center in your mind in this moment as you begin this journey for justice?
Well, what's front and center of my mind is building a case where every link in the prosecutorial chain is very, very strong, from the beginning to the end. That we think about how to put together this case in a way that can be compelling to a jury. The fact is that these cases are really intense, if I may, and you can probably build on the list that I would generate. But we know Walter Scott, his state case ended in a hung jury. We know Philando Castile, the defendants were acquitted, who shot him right there in suburbs of St. Paul. And it was all, you'll remember that the Philando Castile's girlfriend went Facebook Live and everybody saw it. Of course, Freddie Gray, there was never any conviction in that case. And of course, we all know Rodney King. Right. Now, there might be other cases, Kim, that you've studied and worked on where it is difficult, but it's not impossible. In fact, an officer got convicted of murder in Minnesota within the last few years. Now, it is an interesting case because the defendant was an Black Somali immigrant on the Minneapolis Police Department who shot a white woman. Now, I would submit that Mohammed Noor should have been prosecuted for what he did. The problem is not that he was prosecuted. The problem is other people who've acted similarly never were.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So we're up against it, but it's not a battle that we can't overcome, but we got to be tight. We got to be clear. We got to be strong. We got to be compelling. We got to tell the right story. And we got to really humanize George Floyd. And I'm so glad people are lifting him up. He never claimed to be a perfect person, but everything I hear about him is that he's a good person. His employers he used to be like a security guy at nightclubs, and he was a big guy. So people knew, that he was a big guy, but they call him a gentle giant, he was a person who really was speaking against gun violence. He would counsel young men, particularly young Black men, that settling disputes with violence and guns was the wrong way. He was a devout Christian, very, very into his faith. And so, I'm so glad that we were able to escape the usual smear that happens to people who are victims in cases like this. We all know about people trying to muddy up Trayvon Martin and muddy up Eric Garner. Of course, that's another case where there was no bill of indictment. Mike Brown, no bill of indictment. So, we've actually gone further in this case than often happens. We've got charges against responsible individuals, and we're plowing forward with that investigation. By the way, Kim, if I may, there's a parallel federal investigation, what they call a color of law investigation, which is essentially a civil rights investigation. And so that is proceeding. We're working together. And so that's sort of the score. That's what we're facing here.
Yeah, yeah. And just to mark how unusual it is that the police officers were fired with without a lot of well, you might not know something, or there might be some issue that is still yet to be resolved with respect to whether they can continue to be police officers. I also understand from an announcement yesterday that the governor has announced an investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department. So this is at least a moment that many of us have not seen before. The legal political establishment really launching into action rather than the usual dragging their feet. And
Right.
yet I do think it might be important just to manage some expectations. Like, this is not going to be like tomorrow.
Right.
It's going to take a while for this to play out. Yeah. So just so people know about that. And I just wonder, as we are waiting to see how the wheels of justice will turn in this case, and while you're doing the hard work of trying to seek justice in a legal system that is surely an imperfect one, what is it that you hope the wider community of those who were sickened by this kind of violence should be doing? Where should the energies be directed at this moment?
This is an excellent question, and I really thank you for asking me that, because there is a lot of things to do besides think about only this case. We want people to support the case. We want to keep information in front of people. But look, in every city, in every county of America, there needs to be an improvement in police community relationships. Let's just start with the fact that there's a very high percentage of officer involved killings and deadly force encounters with police where the person is in a mental health crisis or a chemical health crisis. What if we talked about dual responses as opposed to just send the police who really don't have any other tools besides a gun and a nightstick? What if we had dual responses where we would have people, officers go out with mental health professionals to really help make sure everybody lives? The other thing, what if we understood that that de-escalation, anti-racism training, what if we empowered the chiefs much more and really held them accountable for who was on their department? Yes. Of course, yes. There needs to be real reform in the unions. I'm a pro-union person. I never met a union I didn't like, except the Minneapolis Police Federation, which is a very odd union because, if you got a nurse, imagine a nurses union that hated the patients, right?
Yeah.
And mistreated them and abused them systematically. Yeah. So this particular case, we need to reform the relationship between the Federation, because the president acts like an alternative chief. And he's not. Our chief is Madera Arredondo, duly confirmed and appointed by the mayor and the city council. And so, bottom line is, this guy who sort of we know he was at the Trump rally. We know, which is fine.
We saw a clip of him basically saying that their union is pro-Trump because he removes the handcuffs of the federal, sort of the investigations that were done by the Justice Department. They see the investigations into civil rights violations as handcuffs. This is the police union head saying this. So we know of which you speak.
Very true. Very true. So we've got a number of things, and this is going to take people sitting down. Now, you and I, we've been at our fair share of, public demonstrations. They're dramatic. They get your blood up, and it feels great to be out there raising your voice. And that is really important. I support the protesters' First Amendment rights. But the real work is in those rooms where we're renegotiating police union contracts, where we're talking at the legislature about the need for a better standard for deadly force, where we are making sure that, policing that goes on among immigrant communities, like the Immigration Customs Enforcement, that's policing too. What is the relationship there? Do we need to look at that? But we need an army, just tons of people to just say, we're going to engage the people who have the power over to incarcerate us, take our liberty, and even take our lives. And we're going to set a new relationship where there's real democratic control as opposed to what we have now. And this is a real thing. I mean, for example, there has not been one pattern and practice lawsuit brought by the Trump administration since he got in office. And in fact, they tried to roll him back in the city of Chicago and in other places. But there's so many cities that need these kind of consent decrees that require that they do reforms. And so, I mean, there's a lot to be done. I think we need to do it. And I would say, if you don't mind me going one more point, Kim, look, we all saw the case of Mr. Copeland, where he was bird watching. I didn't even know the brothers bird watch, but I mean, you can, hey, it's legal, right? Hey, why not, right?
Yes.
Do you, man? I'm all for that. But my point is, he's bird watching. The lady's violating the leash law in the park, and she says, "A black man's threatening my life," and which is a patent lie, And that man could have got killed.
Yeah.
Well, don't forget about the guys in the Starbucks, or don't forget about the folks who are, the civilians who call the police on black people just doing normal stuff all the time. These people are going to be asked to be on the jury. This is the jury pool. I mean, it's very important.
That's real.
That we have really some real engagement at the faith community level, at the job level, the neighborhood level, and say, why do you think I'm out to harm you, or I don't belong here, or that you're deputized to control my behavior when I'm doing nothing but looking at birds, and you're violating the leash law. And yet, you can call the police on me and claim that I was doing something to you, and what the likely consequence of that will be. So, I mean, there's a lot of work that we need to do in Peoria, Illinois, Ely, Minnesota, upstate New York. I mean, we need to get local on this. And there's a lot of work for all of us to do.
And we so appreciate you letting us know what we can do and what we should be doing. I know you have to go shortly. I've just got two more quick questions that I think our listeners would really want to know. And you sort of referred to the doing something while Black, kind of frame, where you're going to be doing a prosecuting while Black. That's the right thing that's next. And I'm sure even as we speak, there are people who are gearing up to make a claim that you should recuse yourself from any role in this because of your history of being a racial justice advocate. Judges like A. Leon Higginbotham were frequently asked to recuse themselves in cases around which they said that history makes them biased. So just getting ahead of it, knowing it's coming, what do you say to that?
Well, of course, it's ridiculous, but that doesn't stop people from making ridiculous charges. I mean, the bottom line is I have at all times acted professionally in accordance with the ethical requirements of the job. I've not commented about evidence. I have not commented about any matter that I am required to stay quiet about. I have maintained a very strong standard and maintained it among my staff. So they're going to come my way. But here's the thing, these people have been coming after me so long that I have no fear of them, right? I mean, at some point when the bullies keep, you get used to the bully, right? Mm-hmm. So Sean Hannity, he says, "Oh, Ellison shouldn't be on this case."
Oh, so whatever. Happened already.
Yeah. It's already happened. But man, I have no concerns about this guy. We know they're going to say a lot of stuff. They're going to bring up that I failed my 8th grade spelling test. They're going to, that's how they roll,
Yeah.
But you know what? We're not going to back down. We're going to insist on justice. You know, and as I told my staff, you know, we're only going to bring the highest, we're going to bring the highest ethical charges we can bring. We're not going to charge something we don't have any facts to support, but we're going to bring the charges on every case where there's factual basis and legal support for that charge. We're not going to undercharge it for any particular reason. We're seeking out justice, and that is just the way that it is.
Yes. Well, General Ellison, before you leave, I guess my last question is, at some point, this moment will be part of history. There will be a story that will be told about this. What's your hope about what this story will be?
I hope that this is an inflection point where we begin to meaningfully balance the scales of justice. You know, look, African Americans in captivity for 243 years. I marked the end of Jim Crow's 1965 Voting Rights Act, so that legal state-sponsored second-class citizenship for another 100 years. There's only been 55 years of anything else, and they've been marked by stark disparities in every facet of American life: policing, incarceration, healthcare, you know, housing, everything. And you know, we've got to change this. We have a right to live in liberty and justice for all, like anyone. And this may be a moment where we can really set a new course, you know, and I hope that it is. And I hope that people don't let the urgency of the moment fade, and that they dig in for the long term, and that they get involved, and that they, you know, really take voting and things like that really seriously. People say to me, well, voting, what does voting ever do? I said, well, you know what? If voting is no big deal, then why are they always trying to suppress your vote?
Well,
you know? Wow. And so I hope that this is an inflection point for change, that we can look back on and say, you know what? That tragic thing happened to George Floyd. It was awful. But you know what? We laced up our shoes. We came together in human solidarity, all colors, all cultures, all faiths. And we said, we're going to write a new chapter of justice in America. That's what I hope we got right in front of us.
Well, thank you so much, General Ellison. Your public service in these times is such a beacon of hope for so many of us. We appreciate you, and we appreciate you being here. Be safe, be well, and be strong. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. And let me just give a shout out to your awesome guests. I really love the work that all of them do. And, you know, Alicia, you know, I'm a big fan of yours. So we'll talk to y'all later, and God bless.
Bye-bye. Thank you. So before turning to our magnificent panelists, as General Ellison rightly said, I wanted to nod to the man whose words gave us the name of this episode, James Baldwin. His book, The Fire Next Time, was written at another axial moment in American history. I've returned to it this week for guidance and for understanding in the midst of my own disheartedness. His writings, so poetic, jarring, saturated, and transcendent in their time, have helped inform my thinking. I think we should all sit with his wisdom today and every day with the knowledge that, quote, to act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. The danger is laid bare in times of crises, and for Black Americans, that crisis has had a 400-year story. We see it in this moment, and we see it in the heartbreaking fact that Friday is Breonna Taylor's birthday. We should be preparing to celebrate her 27th birthday. Her hopes, made heartbreakingly clear in some of her final posts on social media, were for a life of possibility. It's hard not to think of the question she might be asking herself. What would she be doing now? Where would she be at work? What would the likelihood of her having kids be? These were questions that were cut short when her door was beaten down and policemen took her life. She should still be here. So tonight, we gather in community to mourn, to remember, and to rewrite what it means to be part of history. We come together to do everything in our collective power to ensure that the slaying of Black lives and the erasure of those pushed to the margins are no longer conditions of our everyday possibility. So we move forward with another hero's words in our ears, that of Audre Lorde, saying, to refuse to participate in the shaping of our future is to give up. Each of us must find our work and do it. So with that, I turn to those who have found their work and are sure doing it. We'll start by hearing from Alicia Garza, co-founder of Black Lives Matter, principal at Black Futures Lab, and special projects director at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Robin D.G. Kelley, professor of American history at UCLA, and the author of Race Rebels, Culture, Politics, and the Black Working Class, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, and Thelonious Monk, his story, his song, his times. We'll take a quick break to check in on the conversation happening out there in the virtual universe. And then when we come back, we'll hear from Maria Moore, a member of the Say Her Name Family Network and the sister of Kayla Moore, a Black transgender woman killed by Berkeley police. And finally, we'll hear from Devon Carbado, a prominent legal scholar of critical race studies at UCLA Law School, and the author with Mitu Gulati of Acting White, Rethinking Race in Post-Racial America. So thank you all again for joining us this evening. Let's get started. I want to turn first to Alicia and talk about Black Lives Matter, then and now. So 7 years ago, 3 Black women launched an organizing effort under the declaration, the aspiration that Black Lives Matter. And of course, you were one of them, along with Opal Tometi and Patrisse Khan-Cullors. So we're here again, thousands of people in the streets protesting senseless deaths of George Floyd, coming at the heels of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. I can only imagine a sense of frustration that you might be having, that once again, we're facing the same lethality that took the lives of Mike Brown, Tanisha Anderson, Eric Garner, Corinne Gaines, the list goes on and on. But beyond the frustration, is there more that you're sitting with right now?
Absolutely, and thank you, Kim. I'm so honored to be able to take part in this conversation at this moment. You know, it has been 7 years, and this week has been really surreal in a lot of ways. I started this week feeling hopeful, but also shocked, honestly. I mean, this week, you know, we heard President Obama say Black Lives Matter and put out in a list of organizations that you can take action with, that the work that Black Lives Matter is doing is important in this moment. And he actually names the movement for Black Lives. He names the Black Futures Lab. And I say that not to name check our organizations. I say it to say what a difference 7 years has made. There was a time that still is close to my heart when we were saying Black Lives Matter, and we were met with the refrain that all lives matter, that we were being, you know, too radical, too visionary. We were pushing things too far, and that really what we needed to do was to follow the system and to not be too disruptive and to not want too much change too fast. And in this moment, as I'm watching rebellion sweep the country, I can't help but feel both heartened, right, by the dedication and the commitment that myself and thousands of organizers had and still have across the country to keep going, even though we were being told that we should not. With that being said, my heart is also broken because I don't fetishize what rebellion means or looks like. The reality is, while people are rising up, while they are stepping forward to say we have to change what's happening in this society, we're out here because once again, a Black person's life has been extinguished at the hands of the people who are supposed to keep us safe. And because we were not and still have not been being listened to about not only what is happening in our communities, but the solutions that we know we need to implement now in order to change what's happening in our communities. Unfortunately, this is where we end up. I will end with just saying that there's a choice that is in front of us right now. Frankly, we have a choice to determine whether or not we use this moment to tinker with the systems that we already know fail our communities, from policing to the lack of affordable and accessible housing to low wages that are not enough to support a family? Are we going to use this moment to tinker with what is, or are we going to use this moment to transform towards what can be? And are we going to use this moment to begin to invest intentionally in the infrastructure that Black communities deserve to access power, the power that we need to reshape the rules that have been rigged against our communities since we were brought here, and the power that we need to lead this country out of the quicksand that it continues to get itself in over and over again.
Yes, yes. And as you talk about, whether this moment is going to be a fundamentally different one, of course, it raises questions of whether protest is going to be viewed differently than it has in the past, and Black protest in particular. So I was struck, and I'm sure many people were, by the claim that Trump made, that the protest was being promoted by Antifas, and the Antifas are terrorists. Now, of course, he has no authority to declare them to be terrorists, and the FBI has disclaimed any evidence that Antifa has been playing a role in what has been denounced by Trump as the violence and the protests. But there is something familiar about this effort. As I'm sure many of our listeners know, the FBI has adopted the threat designation of a new category called Black identity extremism. And they have placed it on par with the Klan and other countless organizations. Now, this is breathtaking, right? Anti-racist activists are basically demanding for the police to stop killing Black people with impunity. They're placed in the same category as white supremacists, individuals and organizations that have actually killed more people than all foreign terrorism that's happened on American soil. So first of all, to be put on the list in the first place is outrageous. But then to be put on par is putting napalm into the wound. This is not, though, historically unprecedented with respect to the efforts of the government to frame Black activism. So when you experience this and you see Black identity extremism, how does that sit with you? What does that bring up for you?
Well, it brings up a lot for me. And my sister Patrice, she wrote a book called When They Call You a Terrorist, and the real impact of what it means to attempt to surveil and control a movement that is fighting for the liberation and freedom of all of us, because we deeply understand that when Black people have a chance to get free, everybody has a chance to be a little bit more free. And when I look at what's happening with the designation of Antifa as a terrorist organization, a domestic terrorist organization, I can't help but remember that first and foremost, there's a long pattern, right, of trying to suppress unrest in this country by declaring unrest an enemy of the state. But more than that, I think we have to be mindful that it is always used as a useful distraction at a time of great change. During the time of Black Power, right? The Black Panther Party was targeted by the government, surveilled, infiltrated, agitated to turn against each other, and largely, right? Disavowed by forces that wanted to change the way that people understand what it was that the Panthers were fighting for. It's the same thing with Black Lives Matter. As the movement is coming to a height, suddenly we start to see these categories about Black identity extremists. And now with Antifa, which if people don't know, just stands for anti-fascist, and it is not an organization. This is a framework, right, that exists in a moment where we are careening towards fascism. And so the question that I think we all need to ask ourselves right now is, are we going to allow ourselves to be caught up in narratives that are not our own. But also it's an opportunity for us to decide where we stand, on what side of history do we stand. We don't have to ask ourselves who we would have been during the last period of civil rights. In fact, you got to ask yourself who you would have been 7 years ago. And right now you get to ask yourself who you would have been. Are you on the side of the impending approach of this country towards fascism, or are you against it? And I think, you know, movements like Black Lives Matter have really placed that question front and center. And I think that we have work to do still to make sure, again, that we don't just tinker with this moment, but that we protect ourselves and this country from the kinds of designations of people who are fighting for our rights, people who are fighting for justice. We have to fight back against the designation of these movements as domestic terror organizations when we don't deal with the actual terror that is happening in our communities, particularly racial terror that is being inflicted and enacted, not by just paramilitary and militia groups, but in fact being encouraged by our president.
Yes, yes. And, you know, I think for some of our younger listeners, they may be unaware of the fact that Martin Luther King was targeted as the most dangerous man in America. Why? Because he was a warrior for racial justice. Racial justice has a long history of being framed as opposite of American interests. And that history extends to today, to this notion of Black identity extremists. Just to put a point, to be labeled a Black identity extremist, all you have to do is believe that America is a white supremacist order and the police are a part of that. You don't have to take an action. You don't have to advocate for violence. All you have to do is believe that. Whereas to be labeled a dangerous organization that is a white supremacist, you have to believe in white supremacy. You have to actually actively call for white supremacy. So the asymmetry goes to the core of how law enforcement has viewed Black activism. So on that front, I want to dig a little deeper into this historical context with my colleague, Robin Kelley. And as I'm sure is the case, you've had plenty of people reaching out to you to try to help you, to try to help them understand the anatomy of rioting. Yet what seems to also be, I guess, a big hole in people's understanding is that race riots have historically been riots against Black people. We're looking at the 99th anniversary of one of the worst massacres in American history. We just had it this week. So with your historical lens, help us fill the void that we're seeing repeated over and over again, particularly in mainstream coverage.
Right. Well, thank you. And by the way, I am a Black identity extremist, apparently.
I think we probably all are.
Well, you know, one thing it's important to realize is that the history of race riots in America are primarily histories of racial pogroms. That is violent attacks, looting, murder, mayhem directed at Black communities, Black businesses, Black churches, Black homes. We can go back to Cincinnati in the 1830s. You could talk about Chicago, 1919. You could talk about East St. Louis. You could talk, I mean, there's a whole list, Springfield, Illinois. And if you just count the numbers of bodies, the amount of property destroyed and stolen, we're talking about an amount that would far exceed the amount of damage done in the period far exceed the amount of damage done in the period from 64 to 72, when you had 300 cities on fire, and 60,000 people arrested. So I think it's important to recognize that. And also, in the case of Tulsa, as we're celebrating the 99th or commemorating 99th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, you know, how important these acts of mob violence were for maintaining not just white supremacy, but for actually maintaining the state. These are all state sanctioned. The police played a role in facilitating, organizing, and leading some of these pogroms against Black people. And it has really, and this is not just the antebellum period, but we're talking about an acceleration of this kind of violence in the postbellum period. One other thing I would add to that is that these attacks are not simply grounded in trying to appropriate property or destroy Black bodies. That's definitely the case. They were political, direct political forms of violence. They were violence directed at organizations attempting to vote, attempting to maintain autonomy, attempting to hold land, and more importantly, attempting to run for office, hold office during Reconstruction, after Reconstruction, in parties that were largely Black-led, but also multiracial at the time.
And at the same time, I can hear listeners saying, yes, we know all that was then, but this is now. We're in a fundamentally, sort of different moment. And violence is just violence. Law and disorder is law and disorder. Trying to put the racial overlay, on it is, to some people, I think is a stretch. And watching television, for example, you see the consequences of this denial of the politics of how violence is being framed, playing out again and again. So you see so much consternation about attacks on property, about how shameful it is that buildings have to be boarded up on Madison Avenue and Beverly Hills. And so while there is this consternation about assaults on buildings and on property, the violence of the state, the violence of police, the violence against peaceful protesters, the violence against journalists, all this seems to equate the concern about the destruction of human life with the destruction of property, even if it's an equivalence. And many times it's not. It really seems like people are more upset about what's happening in Madison Avenue or Beverly Hills. So are there ways that this false equivalency can be understood with historical analogs to help us see more clearly just how order and protection of property is part of a fundamental logic that's been there since the beginning of the Constitution, that places property ahead of freedom, ahead of liberty, and specifically ahead of the well-being of Black people.
Right. There's no question that in all the requests I get from media, almost everyone asks the same question: why is there looting? So looting becomes the operative term. Looting is only defined in terms of property damage, which is treated as violence, like ipso facto violence. And so what ends up happening is that you have this kind of dichotomy between those who are sort of the good protesters, the peaceful law-abiding, versus the bad protesters bent on violence and destruction, and therefore, ergo, the looters. And what ends up happening is that those people who end up being identified as quote unquote looters are criminalized and of course racialized. We've seen the way that looting and looters get defined both during Hurricane Katrina, for example, and certainly in almost all civil disturbances get defined as Black. But the looting of our communities ends up not being considered, let alone the death and destruction, the violence, let alone the fact that we're talking about tens of thousands of people murdered, in fact, murdered in the 19th century, let alone in the 20th and 21st century, tens of thousands of people murdered without compunction, with impunity by police and by vigilantes. But when we start looking at, what do we mean by looting? We can talk about the looting of thousands, if not millions, thousands of acres of land by the state, the loss of land and property, being excluded from institutions, for being looted of our tax revenue when we're paying for taxes for white supremacy, and for segregated institutions. We could talk about the looting of Black property through redlining, slum clearance, federal rating systems. We can even talk about the looting of Black tax revenue through municipalities that use fees and fines to fleece us. And through those fees and fines that are overrepresented, we know about this for Ferguson, we know this for St. Louis, Minneapolis, we see a transfer of wealth from or actually deeper immiseration and poverty, the transfer of money, which then goes to municipal coffers that pay out for settlements on police misconduct cases. With cities like Minneapolis paying $21 million over several years, or Chicago, $500 million over several years. My own city of Los Angeles, I think it was $880 million at one point over a 10-year period for wrongful death or police misconduct cases. So looting is going on all the time. It just doesn't look like, the looting of stealing shoes from a shoe store or breaking into Walgreens. But once again, all this demonstrates what the question suggests, and that is that Black life does not come close to the value of a store window, and we saw this with Kalief Browder, where a backpack, the contents of a backpack was worth more than his life.
Yeah. And, for those who may want to know more about what you just mentioned, Robin, the use of the criminal justice system and policing to basically put the Black community in Ferguson in the position of being their ATM. Whenever they needed to increase revenues, they increased fines and fees, and that, of course, increased the policing. This is part of the Justice Department's Ferguson report. It was the report that was subsequently effectively withdrawn by the Trump administration. And of course, we can't forget that for Black people, seeking freedom was at one point in our history when we were enslaved, the crime was theft. We were stealing ourselves. Seeking freedom was stealing, right? So what counts as stealing, what counts as looting is against a backdrop of where property is actually constituted. And that has been racially constituted, as my colleague Cheryl Harris has written throughout our history here. So I want to thank General Ellison, Robin Kelley, Alicia Garza for getting us started. And before moving to our next panelist, I'm going to ask AAPF's Awoye Tempo to give us a brief rundown of what we've been hearing online so far. Awoye.
Hi, Kim. It's good to see you.
Hey.
And thank you so much to everybody who's listening on Zoom, who's listening on YouTube, and everybody who's participating in the chat, and to all of our panelists. There's a lot of thoughts and observations going on about the various forms of police reform. People are talking about defunding the police, reframing the legal concept of resisting arrest, repealing the 1994 crime bill, demilitarizing the police. And there's other thoughts that also range to abolishing the police and also prisons entirely, as we look at the very conception of police departments and the relationship to Black people. So there's lots of thoughts and observations and frustrations and hopes being articulated in the chat box, but we'll check back in with you later on in the show.
All right, thanks, Awoye. So Maria, I've been seeing so many posters, so many memes linking the death of Eric Garner to the death of George Floyd, and bringing them together with their haunting last words, "I can't breathe." One might have added to that litany of words, the words of your sister, Kayla Moore, whose last words were also, "I can't breathe." Or we might add the haunting words of Natasha McKenna, whose last words were, "You promised you wouldn't kill me." So as an activist for justice for your sister, and as part of the broader family of women of Say Her Name, all of whom are fighting both against the loss of their daughters and sisters to police violence, but also against the erasure of their loss, the loss of that loss. What's coming up for you in this moment?
Yeah, it's very emotional right now. Seeing what happened, hearing those words, "I can't breathe," just brought up everything for me in terms of what Kayla was going through that night. She was in her own home. She was calm. She wasn't violent. And what she was met with was a wellness call that turned into her untimely death. And what did she do? She didn't do anything wrong. She committed no crime. She was in a mental health state of mind. She was, actively psychotic because she thought she was seeing things that weren't there. But it just brings up the fact that she was doing something normal in her own home. It's okay to be in your home and to have a mental health crisis. It's okay if you're in your home and you're intoxicated. You're in your home. She wasn't bothering anyone. But those cops, when they came to her door, they saw her and they didn't see her as a person. They saw her as an it. And that's typically how the police view people, Black people, and especially, Kayla being transgender. They didn't see her as human. And they didn't take the time to talk to her. These were officers that were called for a wellness check. And what they did to her was they tried to basically arrest her. They ran a warrant check on her. The first thing that they did before they even spoke to her. And the warrant that came up was for someone who had her dead name. It was for a different date of birth. It was not a valid warrant, but they told her that she was going to jail and she panicked. So the first thing they did was they all piled on top of her. So can you imagine, you're in your home, you're cooking dinner, the cops come, and within minutes, you have 6 officers on top of you. And her last dying words were, "I can't breathe," and she was screaming. So this is sort of what we've had to deal with for the past 7 years. And what's so frustrating is since this time, we have been doing nothing but advocating, trying to get the city to make changes. We know this, it's common sense that officers should not be first responders to mental health crisis calls, period. They're not equipped to do it. They at one point they have what's called crisis intervention training, and it sounds very nice, but what it is, it's a 1-day 8-hour course that officers take to learn to de-escalate, to handle people who are in crisis. That's absolutely unacceptable. You wouldn't go to see a doctor who took, an online class for 1 day to become a doctor. You just wouldn't do it. So we need to start having less cops at these mental health scenes, but we also need more social workers and psychologists out there. For me, I recently joined the Mental Health Commission at Berkeley. And one of the things that I wanted to do first was to address mobile crisis, because we don't need cops to be the ones, the first responders, to have to talk to people or to de-escalate. They're not capable of this at this time.
Right. And, I just want to lift up the work of our sister, and say her name, Fran Garrett, whose daughter, Michelle Cusseau, was killed when police came for a pickup order. And, she was safely in her own home, did not want to leave. The police officer who scaled her fence and encountered her shot her because he said the look on her face made him fear for his life. The look on her face. Natasha McKenna, a Black woman in custody who was killed when 6 hazmat uniformed white cops brought her out of the cell. She was nude, had her handcuffed to the cell door, then handcuffed to the restraining chair, then hooded, and then she was tased 3 times. And like your sister, they seem to not even notice that she was not breathing or care that she was not breathing. So, you know, her case was raised again for me, and I'm sure for you as well, in thinking about your sister, when I heard, you know, on a transcript of the killing of George Floyd, one of the officers saying something about, you know, this excited delirium. I mean, he actually quoted the idea of excited delirium. And the first time I encountered excited delirium was in the autopsy of Natasha McKenna. And I was like, what the heck is, what is this excited delirium? So Maria, what is excited delirium, and how does this play a role in making it difficult to even establish that a homicide has occurred?
Yeah, it's a way of blaming the victim for their death. And excited delirium is not real. This is something that is made up. So basically, there's this surge of adrenaline that rushes to the brain and the heart, and the person basically just miraculously dies. And we know that's not the case, that this is not proven, it's not science, it's just a way to justify the killing and to take accountability from the officers in the scene. So we know that it's not a real diagnosis. I mean, people, it's been debunked, and I think that if this continues to be used in modern science today, that's completely unacceptable, because no one should ever believe in that. So, yeah.
Yeah. So what's so fascinating is you have a uniformed officer who knows enough about this frame that he is actually citing it while they're killing someone, right? So it was you know, shocking on top of shock that there's awareness of this false frame. So Maria, thank you so much for your leadership, your willingness to consistently fight for justice, not only for Kayla, but for so many other Black women who were killed by the police. We're never going to stop saying Kayla's name, lifting up her story, and remembering her life. I want to now turn to Devon Carbado just to give us a sense of sort of the silent backdrop. I mean, we've been talking about this largely as though we're dealing with, you know, either exceptional cases of harm from policing. Sometimes, you know, we move more into a structural understanding, but it's all against sort of this backdrop that assumes that the law is, you know, somehow not actively facilitating in this moment. So what are the facilitative dimensions of the law as it's playing out in some of these cases that needs to be understood more clearly?
So thank you very much, Kim, for bringing us together and for the really important programming that the Policy Forum has put on over the past few months. So this is a really difficult moment in which to find one's oppositional voice. And I'm not one who's typically lost for words, but this is really a hard moment. And part of the difficulty just has to do with the fact that, you know, you're sick and tired of the same old frames. And one of the frames that sometimes circulated is about bad cops in particular. And I don't think I need to explain to anyone who's on this line why that might be problematic. What I want to do is remind us of something I think we all know, that the kinds of racial subordination and acts of state violence to which Black people are routinely subjected are not extra legal always. Many of those forms of violence are constitutionalized. Slavery was constitutionalized. Jim Crow was constitutionalized. Mass incarceration is constitutionalized. Stop and frisk is constitutionalized. So this is a moment in which I think we need to recognize that the problem of state violence against Black people is not a rule of man problem. It is also a rule of law problem. And you can see that in very distinct ways if you focus in on a few areas of law. So let's say we thought about the Fourth Amendment just for a minute as kind of one site for legitimizing violence against Black people. So that's the text of the Fourth Amendment. Many of you may or may not have read this text, but this sanitized language is precisely what courts interpret to determine the precarious line between stopping Black people and killing Black people. This is where it happens. So if you want to think about stop and frisk, you got to talk about the Fourth Amendment. If you want to think about excessive force, you got to talk about the Fourth Amendment. If you want to think about traffic stops, pedestrian stops, you have to talk about the Fourth Amendment, except we're not doing that. So let me give you a concrete example of what I mean, and this is a test for you, Kim. So if I were to tell you that you conduct a limited empirical investigation into newspaper coverage, and your question is, well, how many articles discuss race and police violence? Let me tell you the answer, 10,000. Now the question is, how many articles discuss race, policing, and the Fourth Amendment? What's your guess?
15%, 20%.
Try again.
10%.
All right, you're gonna get sick of me saying try again. So look, this is not hard empiricism. I'm not done with the look, but again, policing, race, the Fourth Amendment, seven hits, 7 results.
7 hits, not 7%, like 7 hits.
7%, 7 hits. And again, Fourth Amendment is the constitutional domain in which we work out whether whether use of force is excessive, whether stops and frisk is legitimate, whether driving while Black is unconstitutional, etc. You name a police problem that you want to talk about, and I'll say, go to the Fourth Amendment. And yet it's not a part of our public consciousness. There's just something deeply wrong with that.
And yet it's not being talked about. It's not the go-to, even when we're in this moment of marching. So one can look at the sea of, chants and demands and posters in any of the protests that we've been to. And I would guess that you'd be hard pressed to find anything that says, expand the Fourth Amendment or, change the Supreme Court. People don't see it as a site of resistance. So I'm wondering, what would we need to know, for example, about the vulnerability that Breonna experienced? What does the Fourth Amendment do or say to protect, or should have been able to protect, Breonna? EMT workers sleep in her own home. These people barge in, plain clothes. It looks like it is a home invasion. It just happens to be one with a badge. So where is the connection that we need to know between the Fourth Amendment and this moment?
Well, I think Breonna's case is really important for us to talk about, not just because her life mattered, it clearly did, not just because doing so allows our conversation to be more gender inclusive, it would, but because her case puts into sharp relief dimensions of race and gender and police power that, again, are not always robustly a part of our collective consciousness. So here are just 4 lessons that we might learn from her case that are really important. One, again, that the Fourth Amendment matters. So her case is about warrants, a no-knock warrant, right? And that fact opens up space for us to ask a question. So what's this story about warrants all about? So one thing we need to know, it seems to me, is that the fact that police officers might have warrants doesn't make their policing warranted. In other words, you can have unwarranted policing with warrants. And there are a number of specific ways to make that point. I showed you the text of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment requires warrants to have probable cause. So here's another quiz. So what does probable cause mean? Does it mean 70%? No. Does it mean 60% likelihood that someone's done something? No. Does it mean 50%? No. You're probably saying, just tell me the answer.
Please.
No. Does it mean 30? Maybe. It's somewhere between 25 and 30%. That's a really low threshold. So when cops have warrants, they have 25 to 30% likelihood that you've done something wrong. Second, warrant says that things must be particularly described. People must be particularly described. Are Black people typically particularly described, or are we just Black in these particular documents? So that's another problem that I think we need to think about. The third thing is this. Police officers routinely make mistakes with warrants. So a cop has a warrant to search A person's house. They search B person's house. What happens after the fact? They said it was a mistake. Courts typically conclude that those mistakes are reasonable, particularly if person A is Black and person B is Black. I'm being a little hyperbolic on that point, but you get the idea. So her case gets us to focus on warrants and the extent to which, again, warranted policing or policing with warrants can be very much unwarranted. The other thing I want to say is about no-knock warrants themselves, and this point is important. It turns out that police officers already operate under something like a no-knock warrant regime. What do I mean by that? So the Supreme Court has made two rulings that are relevant on this point. One, let's say that an officer doesn't knock and announce their presence into a particular house. They can say the reason they didn't do so was because the circumstances were exigent. So they had an emergency excuse. The other thing to keep in mind is the court has also said, let's assume that an officer doesn't have an emergency justification, gets into your house, didn't knock and announce, so we're stipulating there's a constitutional problem. The officer still gets to use the evidence that they obtain from that no-knock entry. In other words, entering a home, not knocking and announcing, still entitles the officer to use the evidence. So we don't need no-knock warrants for police officers to engage in no-knock policing. That conversation we're not having, and Breonna's case puts into sharp relief. The final thing I'll say about this, and then I'll stop, that Breonna case is helpful for is this. So when a police officer ends up going to a magistrate and asking for a no-knock warrant, the question is, what standard does the magistrate employ to decide whether to issue that warrant? The answer, whether there's a reasonable basis to think the cop needed it. What does reasonable basis mean? Probable cause? No. Something lower than probable cause, reasonable suspicion, and that should be triggering for you because reasonable suspicion is the standard that emerged in the context of stop and frisk. Stop and frisk becomes constitutional in 1968 in much the same scene of unrest that we're witnessing now, when the man who wrote Brown v. Board of Education, Justice Earl Warren, decides that police officers can stop and frisk you if they have reasonable suspicion to believe that you're armed and dangerous. Stop and frisk, or the logic of reasonable suspicion, didn't shelter in place just there. It's moved to cover a broad swath of Fourth Amendment laws. Concrete examples, and I really will shut up. One, you can stop and frisk cars, believe it or not. You can stop and frisk homes. You can stop and frisk luggage. You can apply reasonable suspicion to stop someone based on their immigration status. You can base your reasonable suspicion as to whether or not someone's undocumented by asking, does the person appear Mexican looking?
Appear. So basically race can be used as a factor.
Explicitly as a part of constitutional law. And the regime of reasonable suspicion also applies at the border. So Black women, for the longest, have been subject to stop and strip at the border based on reasonable suspicion. So again, there are lots of ways in which, if we drill down on Breonna's case, we don't just learn about the particular impact of policing on Black women. We learn about the structure of policing and power more generally, which is why I think we need to think about the space that opens up when we ask the intersectionality question. And this is a moment in which I think this case helps put the Fourth Amendment on the table in the way that it hasn't been put forever.
Yeah, yes. So much that this analysis opens up, both the places outside the public where racial police violence take place. So it is important to have an understanding and awareness of how public space is unsafe space. That's what, the Central Park episode shows us. That's of course what the tragedy of George Floyd shows us. And there's also the so-called private dimension of it, what happens in our homes. And for Black women, what happens in their wombs. The not safe at the border means that Black women are often not safe against strip searches. So broadening our understanding of what anti-Black police violence looks like, casts our attention not just to policing per se, but to law that plays a facilitative role in making this happen. Thank you, Devon, for making this so clear to us. So we're gonna move into our roundtable discussion, but before we do, I wanna check one more time in with Awoye to give us a sense about where the conversation online has been going.
Thank you so much, Kim. So there have been a lot of thoughts of just thanks to Maria in particular for being here today, and words of support and appreciation to the idea of how to and who should respond in the case of a mental health crisis. There's a number of folks also honoring the name of Kenneth Chamberlain. And the larger question too, there's a number of comments about what is the role of voting in all of this? How does it fit into the broader political strategy? And what commitments can we seek from candidates to address what's happening? So thank you so much to all the panelists, and I'll kick it back to you, Kim.
Brilliant, thank you. So panelists, you've heard some of these questions, and I want to invite you to address them in the roundtable. So there are some themes that I kind of want to pick up on that you've hinted at and we know are significant. And I'm going to start with Alicia. So Alicia, as we know, you and your sisters in struggle created a space to assert, to demand that Black Lives Matter. But there are also factors that shape what you were struggling against and that shape the struggle inside of the movement. So I wonder if you might help us think about how patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, how they're not only the problem that we're fighting in the discourse, but they're also problems that we're fighting within our movement. So what are some of the frustrations you've had in trying to make our movement more fully intersectional?
Oh man, well, where do we even start here? Kim and I have had many a conversation about this.
Many.
And I just will say that as we speak, I get questions from people all the time about why do we have to talk about gay people? This is about Black people, as if Black people are not also gay or lesbian or bisexual, as if Black people are not also trans or gender nonconforming. And I think in a lot of ways, we have adopted stories about ourselves that we know deeply from our experience is not who we are. We do have to lift up the names of people like Tony McDade. We have to lift up the names of people like Breonna Taylor, not just to say names. I mean, I have lost track of the litany, but I can say that what becomes important about this is that it helps us understand why this violence is happening in our communities. We know that each of us is targeted differently, but that is also by design. It is also by design that those of us who fall outside of the parameters of the gender binary are attacked, right, in layers of ways for daring to break out of that mold, for daring to not even just, it's not an ideological thing, it's like a daring to live on your own terms.
Yes.
And Black people have always fought to live on our own terms, and yet we still have this challenge of, even within our own communities, using antiquated notions of who gets to live on their own terms and whose terms should be decided by somebody else. So that's a frustration. And, you know, I wish there was a gay agenda because I would sign up for it. I feel like we as a community actually deserve that too. So there's that, and RIP my mentions for saying that. But I'll say it again, and I'll say it over and over and over again. The other thing I just want to add here, though, Kim, is that the other frustration, frankly, is that because we have these stories sold back to us about our resistance, about our legacy of what it means to fight to be fully human in a society that was built on our dehumanization, we continue to look for avatars rather than to celebrate and lift up the people who are showing us the way. I cannot tell you, over the last couple of weeks, I'm like reliving all of the things that we have been dealing with for 7 years, people in my inbox. I'm going to tell you the strategy that you need to make this movement successful, and it's always a man. 100% all the time, always a man. And now I'm documenting because y'all ain't gonna drive me crazy. You know,
mansplaining the movement, huh?
Yeah, like all of these ways in which people say, well, where are the leaders? And it doesn't actually matter if you say, hey, this is something that I and my two sisters started as an organization that then, you know, actually translated to and resonated with so many other folks who were also building their own powerful entities. But the reason that people don't feel like they can find who the leaders are is because they're looking for a Martin Luther King. They are looking for the man who speaks for everybody, right? And looking for the congregation that has circled around them. And so I will just say that until my last breath, and I get really amped about this, so let me just say it again and say it again, Martin Luther King is not coming back. He has been dead for a long time. And, you know, he's not coming back. But you know who is here? Queer women, trans folks, folks who are gender nonconforming, and our brothers are here. You know, there's so many of us that make up the front, right? That is pushing this country to actually live up to what it's been promising it could be since it was incepted. And so I think that we've got to really challenge each other and ourselves around the things that we think are necessary to win a movement that actually don't, or not to win a movement, but to advance it, that actually have nothing to do with advancing our humanity, but have everything to do with keeping us in these small, narrow boxes that are really keeping us from our full humanity overall.
Yes, yes, yes. On that theme, I want to go back to Maria. So when Breonna was killed, her mother entered into a group that you all have called the Sisterhood of Sorrow, the Say Her Name, you know, families. What I want listeners to know and understand is what it was that you all did last year before Breonna Taylor was killed, before Tatiana Jefferson was killed. You all prepared a video. It was sort of a video greeting of sorts to mothers who were not yet in your group, not yet experiencing the thing that you experience. And that's what I mean when I say the sisterhood of sorrow, the experience. Why was it important to all of you to do that? And what are some of the, you know, sort of the consequences of the loss and the loss of the loss? The failure to speak the names of so many of your loved ones that drives you all, that drives Say Her Name.
Yeah, you know, there's no handbook that tells you how to get through this. There's nothing that will guide you through it. It's one of the worst experiences these women, these mothers have gone through, and they've all, when we're together, we are family. It's just a wonderful experience. I've come to love these women, and we just share that bond so deeply. And you know, I can't say enough about them, because every time I'm with them, I get my batteries recharged, and I think we all do. And, you know, making that video, looking back at it, I realized how important it was, especially knowing that video was going to go out to people who had just lost their loved one. And to hear the mothers talk about their experiences, but also wanting to support, it just had me in tears, because it just meant so much in the moment. Because any family member that listens to what they're saying will know that they're going to have people there who will be there for them, that they're not alone. You're not alone in this, because, and I know that families and mothers and parents are feeling this way, but you know, there's a place where you can go where you have support. And I think that video was just so incredibly powerful. And like I said, this is my crew. I love them so much. We all keep in touch, and I can't wait till the next time we're together, because it's that special.
And, you know, shout out to all of the mothers and sisters of Say Her Name, who are reaching out, who have reached out, who, as you said, Maria, there's not a handbook, but there are loving arms. There's the knowing that only you all see and can experience and name and touch. On the question of intersectionality, there are other intersections. We've been talking in this last couple moments about race and gender, but there's also the question of how race and class come together to help us understand not just the distribution of anti-Black police violence, but the context, the contours, the ideologies of its possibilities. So Robin, I want to come back to you as a historian of race and class. You've been part of debates for decades, and most recently those debates have come to a head again as to the role that race can or should play in a politic that robustly addresses class questions. And it seems as though, you know, as General Ellison said, that one particularly ripe site for thinking about some of the limitations of the frame that, you know, class politics, that union politics are in some ways, you know, the don't need a racial lens or a racial angle to fully understand and move through it. And so we talked at the beginning of the show, and then there were some, you know, slides about how the union president of the Minneapolis police not only said, you know, they support Trump because he takes the handcuffs off. He also said, you know, he shot 3 people. He doesn't feel, you know, bad about it at all. For some people, these are the words that might be used as the subtitles to that picture of Chauvin, you know, hand in pocket, taking the life of a human being with the same kind of casualness that, you know, he might swat a fly. So what is it that history might help us think about the relationship between policing and race and gender politics that play out within labor, and in particular within police labor?
Right. Well, police unions are hardly unions in the sense of, you know, they may be working, but they're not really unions in the traditional sense. If anything, you have to remember that one of the most interesting and dangerous police riots took place in New York City when, you know, Mayor Lindsay, you know, decided that maybe we need some kind of oversight, you know, committee to look at police. And they literally, when the Black Panther Party was on trial, the police union staged a riot and started beating up people, beating up Panthers as they're walking into the courthouse. So these are not unions, these are basically thugs that represent, in some respects, public employees. Oh, we're having an earthquake right now. Public employees who really do represent, Trump's base, and by that, Trump, the base for Trump is kind of, is like a historic bloc, a political bloc comprised of right-wing elements, and a portion of a kind of disaffected white working class, some of whom had voted for Obama before, and the public employee workers who are in police unions and in unions that are guard unions for prisons. And what's interesting is that they're not benefiting from the Trump bump. They're not benefiting financially. They're not benefiting in any other way except for the resources available to them. And as General Ellison said, this is a union that hates its clients in some respects. It hates the public, the Black public. And so police unions in some ways represent a kind of exclusionary, racist, I would also say part of the Trump strategy of repressive violence. They represent that. And what's interesting is that those who are arguing for kind of class politics ignore the fact that it's white identity politics that put Trump in office in the first place. And that the identity politics that gets marked as disrupting the potential for class alliance is the identity politics that's deeply anti-racist, that's deeply anti-sexist, that's deeply anti-homophobic and anti-transphobic. I mean, these are the organizations that actually open up the pathway for a class politics that could be more robust. But police unions in particular are those that actually operate in very opposite ways. They represent the kind of a force of repression and violence, and part of their contracts often are contracts that protect them from prosecution.
Yeah, and provide them resources and processes that make it that much more difficult to fully investigate cases when they happen. In our longer conversation, and we'll have to take this up offline, we talked about paddy rollers, and we talked about the role of the original police in sustaining security in moments of slavery and elsewhere. How often white working class men, when they didn't own slaves, were recruited to do that work, and obviously the consequences of that. So there are histories that can be played out and brought into this current moment with awareness that race, class, and gender are playing many different roles in making some people vulnerable and creating the culture that allows for that image that we saw to be reflective of an attitude towards the lives of those that the police. So we've gone over this time because obviously there was a lot to talk about. And I know our folks have a few other webinars that they have to be on. So I want us to take these last minutes to talk about what folks want to leave us with as to what is to be done. And Alicia, I know you're doing another webinar, so let me give the floor first to you to help us think about what is the meantime stuff that we ought to be doing. Where should the energies be directed? What are you excited about in terms of possibilities moving forward?
Well, I was really happy to hear today that the case in Minnesota is moving forward. And I think that we need to make sure that we keep eyes on what's happening there. We need to make sure that that state feels like the nation is watching and like it will set precedent for what is happening across the country. And we know with the leadership of Attorney General Keith Ellison that we will certainly have a robust process, and he's going to need our support and our eyes as well. So that's something that I think is important. The other thing that I just want to say here in terms of next steps is, you know, the thing that I long for the most is that we take this opportunity not to satiate ourselves with short-term solutions that don't actually address the root of the problem, that we are patient with each other enough that we are willing to chart that path together, and that we are courageous enough and we believe in ourselves enough to know that we deserve better than temporary solutions, right? That we actually can have safety and security in our communities that don't rely on badges and guns to provide it, that we can move around resources and the way that we are using resources right now to make sure that we are right-sizing the role that police are playing in our communities, but that we are using the resources that we are diverting to policing and diverting those resources right back to where they were stolen from in the first place. Mental health services, domestic violence services, shelters for people without homes, education, increasing jobs, right? By actually employing our people to hold our communities the way that people did before presidents like Ronald Reagan began to dismantle the safety net. So that is my plea for us, that we are courageous enough to say, we actually deserve a lot more than things like body cameras. We can have the things that we've longed for a long time, and it's right at our fingertips if we'll just stay focused.
And Alicia, if we want to know priorities, where do we look?
Well, you can definitely go and check out colorofchange.org for some immediate things that you can do in terms of keeping the pressure on the case in Minnesota. But you can also go to our website at blackfutureslab.org to learn more about the Black Agenda for 2020 and beyond.
All right, thank you, Alicia. Thank you for joining us. Devon Carbado, so I think you've opened a lot of eyes to what is sort of in the background, but actually shaping so much of what we're protesting now. And I think a lot of folks, particularly, you know, folks who are unaware of the risk of no-knock warrants, don't live in neighborhoods where they have to worry about the police knocking down the door. People who believe that their Second Amendment rights, you know, give them the right to defend themselves, not fully being aware that there's Second Amendment rights for some people and there's racial realities for others. We know Philando Castile is a case in point about the limitations of Second Amendment rights if you are African American. With all of that, what is it that you want to encourage people to think about, to learn about, to be able to talk about with greater literacy?
So I think I'll just start by saying I think this really is a moment in which to not acquiesce in the short-term reformism. I think that's crucial. There's a way in which one could easily reproduce the same set of agenda items that were put on the table post-Ferguson. So I totally co-sign what Alicia just says, that this is not the moment to do precisely that. The second thing I would say is that arguments about rogue this or rogue that push back against them. There are lots and lots of moments in which we're going to hear different kind of claims about illegal behavior. And it's important because the cases that are being litigated now involves illegal behavior, but don't lose sight of the moments of legality that don't end up in courts. So think about the ways in which a number of cases that we're not going to see. 1% of cases that people find troubling vis-a-vis police conduct end up in court, which is to say 90% 99% don't. So let's think about how to lift up those cases by recognizing that legality is part of the problem. And the final thing I'll say is just drawing a line on feminism. You know, politics is kind of where you find yourself. So what are you doing in your particular space to change the conditions possibility for the future that you want?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Devon. Robin, you've been in it, you've been on it throughout your entire career, and yet here we are again. What do you want to leave people with? What parts of history can be mobilized in this moment to help it be perhaps the galvanizing moment that we're most hoping that it could possibly be?
Right. I guess there are two things. One, it's not so much history as much as, you know, I'm heartened by the fact that there's so many organizations. The Movement for Black Lives just put out a new set of demands, building on the COVID-19 demands. They have a week of action. The Rising Majority has been doing amazing work both in around police violence, healthcare, electoral politics, mobilizing at a national level, and especially in Chicago. There's a lot going on, and I think that this is a very exciting time. In terms of history, the one thing I would go back to is just to do what you always do so well, and that is make sure we're always attentive to the way in which gender shapes police violence and shapes our response to it. So one of the areas that we need to pay attention to with respect to Breonna Taylor is the issue of home invasion, and see home invasion as not just about the Castle Doctrine, but about the historical and ongoing right of the police state to invade Black homes, specifically affecting Black women and Black women's homes. Many Black women have been killed as a result of home invasion with impunity. And so we have to pay attention to that.
Thank you,
Oh,
Robin.
one last thing. And
Yeah, sure.
Sarah Haley's doing this work, and I just want to hold her up. My colleague at UCLA, read her work.
And we'll drop links to it on our webpage for that and other information. Maria. I think you're muted. And we still can't hear you. There you are.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
You have the last word.
So my message to everyone listening, you know, mobilize and organize. I think now is the time. It's never been a better time, but get involved, you know. There are many times where we went to city council meetings and we shut it down. We let them know what our agenda was, what we want them to do, but you have to get out there. You have to, you know, create your own, you know, cop watch group, whatever it is in your community that you can do to support each other, because, you know, right now it's very stressful, trying times, but we need to come together. We need to be able to get our point across in a way that people will listen to. And, you know, we're doing this as a community, and within your community, within your neighborhood, within your, you know, your street, just organize and come together, because we have to do more than what we're doing right now.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I first want to thank all of our team at the African American Policy Forum and the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies. And of course, a very, very special thank you to our panelists, Alicia Garza, Devon Carbado, Robin D.G. Kelley, Maria Moore, and of course, Attorney General Keith Ellison. Thank you all for helping us think through this crisis. This has been an important and necessary conversation. We've come back from hiatus because we knew we had to address this issue. Please keep this conversation going with your friends, with your family members, within your community. You can follow us for additional support, materials, ideas across our social media platform at AA Policy Forum, at our website, aapf.org, as we will continue to provide information to galvanize this collective experience into energy that can propel us to another universe of possibilities. We'll do so by our blog on our website, as well as by our podcast, Intersectionality Matters, which is available on iTunes, Spotify, and SoundCloud. We'll be posting this conversation in the coming week, and we'll be giving updates on the series as we move forward. If you want to support our work, please donate to the African American Policy Forum at aapf.org. Donate. Your contribution helps us produce critical conversations like this. I'd also like to direct you to Kate Young, who on Twitter is uplifting Breonna Taylor to organize action for her birthday on Friday. Remember, the officers who killed Breonna have yet to face any accountability or justice for taking her life. You can follow her at Batty Mamzell, that's BATTYMANZELL, for more information on what you can do. On our weekly Under the Blacklight series, we offer a few listeners a more intimate conversation opportunity. We're excited to welcome some of our listeners: Nathaniel Moreau, Ann Ferguson, Carletta Fellows, Gabriela Barbosa, as well as several former panelists and special guests, including Barbara Arnwine, Joe Lowndes, Crystal Femster, to our post-show talkback with myself, some friends, and perhaps even some of today's panelists. Join us for the next installment of Under the Blacklight for a chance to join our post-show talkback. Thank you all and enjoy your evening. Please stay safe and stay strong as we continue to organize and resist.